Well, you just got to love technology, don't you? Um, our computer went down Sunday at New Day Fellowship, so our message did not get recorded. So I'm going to bring you a um, probably a two-part synopsis of the message when thorns remain. Let me begin by reading to you out of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning with verse 7. And the Apostle Paul says this: to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul asked the Lord to take the thorn away from him. And the thorn was all of the persecutions and the trials and the hardships that he faced by being a Christian and out sharing the gospel to a world that was in need. And Paul went through persecutions more than any of us probably ever will. Everything from imprisonments to shipwrecks, beatings, stonings, you name it. And I'm sure that weighed very heavily on him. And he asked the Lord 3 times. He pleaded 3 times, Lord, take it away. Um, but the Lord's answer was no. Instead, Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you. So, what do we do um, with the thorns in our lives when we take them before the Lord and the Lord says, no, I'm not going to remove them? What do we do? How do we handle that? Well, what we need to do is what the Apostle Paul did, and that is surrender to God's grace. And grace comes to us, God's grace comes to us through his power. And so if you look again at verse 9, Jesus said to Paul, he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Those are his thorns, the trials and tribulations, so that Christ's power, again, you see the theme of power, will rest on me. So as we surrender to God's grace, we experience his power to deal with those thorns of life that are not removed. So, what does that grace look like, and how does that power come into play in our lives when we feel the pain and the burn of those thorns that remain? Well, the first way that we see God's grace in the Apostle Paul's life and in ours also is that the thorns, though they may hurt and though they may burn, they will not destroy us. So if you turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 3, you'll see what Paul wrote to Timothy um, about God's grace and power in his life in the midst of those persecutions. And he said to Timothy in chapter 3, beginning with verse 10, he said, you, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance. And here he again references the thorn, persecutions, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, the persecutions I endured. And yet, look at what Paul says about those. This is the power, the grace that God poured out in his life. Look at the next statement by the Apostle Paul. He says, yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. Continually, God's power rescued Paul from the various persecutions, trials, and tribulations that he experienced for being a Christian and out sharing his faith and doing God's work. So even though the thorn remained, because it was one more persecution, one more trial after the other. Each time God would rescue him, and the thorn would not destroy him. The thorn would not take his life until, as we see in chapter 4, once Paul was done with his work for the Lord here in this life, then the thorn would take his life. But yet he could say this in chapter 4, beginning with verse 6. He said, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering." He was in prison in Rome. And he said, "And the time has come for my departure." The thorn would finally take his life. But he said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." God's power will be poured out in your life in the same way that it was the Apostle Paul. And here's something I firmly believe, that the thorns of life will never destroy you until that time in which the Lord says, "Your work in this life has been done. Now it's time for you to go home." That's God's grace. That's God's power poured out in our lives when the thorns remain. But there's some other ways that God's grace and power was evident in the midst of the thorn in Paul's flesh, which we'll look at next time. So thanks for joining me. We got at least part 2, maybe part 3 to finish this up. But thanks for joining us, and to get lots more detail and to be part of the discussion of God's Word, join us at New Day Fellowship every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 115 North Fayette Street here in Shippensburg. 10:30, free breakfast. Then we have worship time. We have a message where people get to interact and share their thoughts. We learn and grow from one another. So we look forward to seeing you there. And I'll see you next time for part 2.